Just after midnight, the sky over Caracas erupted with sounds that people there say they will never forget. Deep, rolling explosions echoed across the city, rattling windows, setting off car alarms, and jolting millions awake in fear and confusion. Residents described the noise as unlike anything they had ever heard before. Not fireworks, not construction, but the unmistakable thunder of military force. Low-flying aircraft were seen cutting through the darkness, moving fast and deliberately, while flashes of light briefly illuminated neighborhoods that moments earlier had been silent. Within minutes, power went out in several districts, plunging entire areas into darkness as sirens and shouting filled the streets. As the explosions continued, unconfirmed reports began spreading rapidly, first through encrypted messages, then across social media, and finally into international newsrooms. The most shocking claim of all followed almost immediately. Venezuela's president had been captured. According to early reports, Nicolas Maduro was taken during a coordinated operation and removed from the country. The claim spread like wildfire, even as official confirmation remained absent and government channels fell eerily quiet. For a country already accustomed to instability, this moment felt fundamentally different, as if history had violently accelerated overnight. By the early hours of the morning, Caracas was a city holding its breath. Military checkpoints appeared on major roads, soldiers moved through strategic locations, and helicopters hovered overhead. People stayed inside, glued to their phones, refreshing feeds that alternated between silence and chaos. Some reports claimed military bases had been struck. Others said communication centers were targeted. Rumors collided with fear, and truth became difficult to separate from speculation. What was clear, however, was that something unprecedented was unfolding. Outside Venezuela, the situation escalated just as rapidly. Statements attributed to U.S. leadership suggested a large-scale operation had taken place, framing it as decisive and successful. The language used was bold, almost surreal, given the magnitude of what was being implied. Meanwhile, Venezuelan state media broke its silence, denouncing what it called foreign aggression and declaring a national emergency. Officials insisted the country was under attack and called on citizens and the armed forces to remain loyal and mobilized. Yet notably absent was any direct appearance by the president himself, which only intensified global speculation about his status. Inside the country, ordinary people were left in a fog of uncertainty. Parents kept children home, businesses remained shuttered, and lines formed at grocery stores and gas stations wherever they were still open. In poorer neighborhoods where electricity and internet access are already unreliable, information traveled by word of mouth, often distorted by fear. Some believed a full invasion had begun. Others thought this was the opening move of a coup. Many simply waited, hoping the violence would not spread to their streets. As dawn approached, the international response began to take shape. Governments across Latin America called emergency meetings. Some urged calm and respect for sovereignty, while others demanded clarification and proof regarding the reported capture of the Venezuelan president. Global markets reacted nervously, and oil prices fluctuated as analysts tried to assess the potential fallout. The United Nations acknowledged the situation and called for restraint, though behind closed doors, diplomats reportedly struggled to determine what information could be trusted. What makes this moment so destabilizing is not only the violence itself, but the ambiguity surrounding it. In modern conflicts, perception often moves faster than reality. And on this night, perception raced ahead at full speed. Conflicting narratives emerged almost instantly. One version portrayed a swift surgical operation that removed a long-standing leader from power. Another described an illegal assault that threatened civilian lives and regional stability. With limited verified footage and restricted access on the ground, the world was forced to watch events unfold through fragments. For Venezuelans, this was not an abstract geopolitical event. It was deeply personal. Many have lived through years of economic collapse, shortages, protests, and repression. The sound of explosions carried with it the weight of all that history, compressed into a single night. Whether this moment represents the beginning of radical change or the start of a far more dangerous chapter remains unknown. As January 3rd continues, one thing is certain: Venezuela woke up to a reality that may redefine its future. The reported capture of a sitting president, the sudden eruption of military force, and the silence where clear answers should be have created a vacuum filled with fear, hope, anger, and disbelief. The coming hours and days will determine whether this night is remembered as a turning point or the opening shock of a much longer crisis. As the morning hours stretched on, the lack of verified information became almost as unsettling as the explosions themselves. Streets that were usually packed with traffic remained unusually quiet, not because calm had returned, but because people were afraid to move. In some areas, soldiers stood at intersections, their faces tense, fingers close to triggers, refusing to answer questions from anxious civilians. In others, there was no visible security presence at all, creating an eerie sense that authority itself had momentarily vanished. Radio stations offered little clarity. Some went off air entirely, while others repeated vague statements about national sovereignty and resistance. Television broadcasts looped the same images of flags, military parades from the past, and pre-recorded speeches, avoiding any direct reference to the night's events. Online, access to certain platforms appeared restricted, slowing the spread of videos and first-hand accounts, though not stopping them completely. Short clips continued to surface, showing flashes in the sky, distant booms, and people filming from balconies with shaking hands. International journalists struggled to verify claims. Requests to reach government officials went unanswered or were met with carefully worded denials that avoided specifics. Was the president captured or not? Was he injured, hiding, or already outside the country? Each unanswered question magnified the tension. Analysts pointed out that even the uncertainty itself could be strategic, designed to destabilize opponents and control the narrative while facts were still forming. Meanwhile, reactions from within the military became a critical focus. Loyalty in Venezuela's armed forces has long been a pillar of the existing power structure, and any fracture there could shift everything. Reports began circulating of units being placed on high alert, of internal meetings held behind closed doors, of commanders issuing contradictory orders. None of it was confirmed, but the possibility alone suggested that the situation was far from resolved. For ordinary citizens, the psychological impact was immediate. Many described a feeling of déjà vu mixed with dread, recalling past moments of unrest that promised change but delivered suffering instead. Others, especially those who had opposed the government for years, felt a cautious, almost guilty sense of hope, tempered by the fear of retaliation or prolonged violence. No one knew which emotion would prove justified. Outside Venezuela, media coverage intensified. Headlines grew more dramatic by the hour, while experts debated what legal, political, and military consequences could follow if the reported capture were confirmed. Some warned of regional destabilization, refugee surges, and retaliatory actions. Others suggested this could mark the end of a long-running political era, yet all of it rested on a foundation of incomplete information. As night approached again, Caracas remained tense. The city felt suspended between two realities, one where everything had changed overnight, and another where the familiar structures of power were still intact, just shaken. People spoke in whispers, avoided crowds, and watched the sky whenever a distant sound echoed. The memory of the explosions had not faded. It lingered in every quiet moment. Whatever the truth behind the reports, January 3rd had already carved itself into the country's collective memory. It was the day uncertainty became total, when the line between rumor and reality blurred beyond recognition, and when a nation was forced to confront the possibility that its future might be decided not through elections or speeches, but through sudden, overwhelming force. This moment, whatever the final truth behind it turns out to be, carries consequences far beyond Venezuela's borders. If the reports of a foreign-backed operation and the capture of a sitting president are even partially true, it marks a dramatic escalation in tensions between Venezuela and the United States, one that would fundamentally reshape their relationship. Decades of sanctions, diplomatic hostility, and proxy pressure would have crossed into something far more direct and dangerous. For Washington, such an action would signal a willingness to abandon indirect leverage in favor of force. For Caracas, it would reinforce long-standing claims that its sovereignty is under constant external threat. Even if the operation stops short of a full-scale conflict, trust between the two nations would be effectively destroyed for a generation. The risk of retaliation would loom large. Venezuela's direct military capabilities may be limited compared to the United States, but asymmetric responses would remain possible. Cyber operations, regional destabilization, alliances with rival powers, or the leveraging of migration pressure could all become tools in a wider confrontation. The fear would not necessarily be of immediate war, but of a prolonged period of instability where each side tests limits, increasing the chance of miscalculation. China would be watching the situation with intense focus. Venezuela has long been a strategic partner for Beijing, particularly through energy investments and loans. From China's perspective, any precedent that suggests regime change through direct military action sets off alarms. It challenges the principle of non-interference that China publicly champions and raises questions about how far the United States might be willing to go elsewhere. While China would be unlikely to respond militarily, its reaction could come through diplomatic pressure, economic maneuvering, and a stronger alignment with countries that oppose U.S. interventionism. Quietly, Beijing would be assessing whether its overseas investments are increasingly vulnerable in a world where power politics are becoming more blunt. Europe's response would likely be fractured. Some European governments would call for restraint, international investigations, and adherence to international law, wary of escalation and humanitarian fallout. Others, particularly those closely aligned with U.S. foreign policy, might frame the situation as a necessary intervention against an authoritarian regime. Still, Europe as a whole would be concerned about knock-on effects. Energy markets, migration flows, and the erosion of norms that have kept great power conflict relatively contained. The discomfort would be less about Venezuela itself and more about what this signals for global stability. Russia would view the situation through a sharply adversarial lens. Moscow has historically positioned itself as a counterweight to U.S. influence in Latin America, and any successful American operation would be seen as both a provocation and a warning. Publicly, Russia would almost certainly condemn the action, emphasizing sovereignty and international law. Privately, it would study the operation closely, extracting lessons relevant to its own strategic calculations. The event would likely harden Russia's resolve to resist Western influence in regions it considers vital, reinforcing a worldview in which compromise is weakness. Ukraine's perspective would be shaped by its own ongoing conflict and dependence on Western support. On one hand, Kyiv might be cautious about endorsing actions that resemble unilateral military intervention, knowing how such precedents can be used rhetorically by its adversaries. On the other hand, Ukraine's leadership would be acutely aware that Western resolve, decisiveness, and willingness to act are central to its own survival. The situation would present an uncomfortable paradox. Strength displayed in one region could reassure allies, but it could also normalize methods that destabilize the global order Ukraine is fighting to defend. Taken together, this event would underline a broader shift in international relations. The world has been moving away from predictable diplomacy and towards sharper, riskier confrontations. Gray zones are shrinking. Actions that once seemed unthinkable are now openly discussed and sometimes executed before the global community can even agree on what has happened. For smaller nations, this raises fears of vulnerability. For major powers, it sharpens competition and suspicion. Whether this moment becomes a contained shock or a catalyst for wider instability will depend on what comes next. Clear communication, verified facts, and deliberate restraint could still pull the situation back from the edge. But if ambiguity continues to dominate, if narratives harden before evidence emerges, and if power is allowed to speak louder than law, then January 3rd may come to be remembered not just as a crisis for Venezuela, but as another step toward a more volatile and divided world. Another way to look at the situation is through the lens of precedent. Around the world, governments and security analysts will be asking a quiet but critical question. If this can happen here, can it happen elsewhere? For smaller or politically isolated states, the fear is not ideological, but existential. The idea that a sitting head of state could be removed through sudden force, followed by days of ambiguity, undermines the assumption that borders and sovereignty provide any real protection. This perception alone, regardless of what ultimately proves true, can push governments to harden internally, restrict freedoms further, and prioritize survival over reform. From the perspective of Latin America, the shock cuts especially deep. The region has a long memory of foreign interventions, covert operations, and externally influenced regime changes. Even countries that have no love for Venezuela's leadership may view this moment with unease. Publicly, some governments may remain cautious or neutral, but domestically, political leaders will be under pressure to distance themselves from anything that resembles a return to those historical patterns. Left-leaning movements may use the situation as proof that external powers cannot be trusted, while right-leaning factions may fear becoming collateral damage in future power struggles. There is also an economic perspective that often gets overlooked in moments like this. Investors hate uncertainty more than almost anything else, and what unfolded has injected a high dose of it into global markets. Energy traders, shipping companies, insurers, and multinational corporations will reassess risk not just in Venezuela, but across politically sensitive regions. The result could be higher costs, tighter credit, and reduced investment, consequences that often hit ordinary people long before they affect political elites. Another perspective comes from within the United States itself. Domestically, such an operation would be deeply polarizing. Supporters might frame it as decisive action against a long-standing adversary, a demonstration of strength after years of stalemate. Critics would argue it risks endless escalation, undermines international norms, and diverts attention and resources from domestic challenges. The lack of transparent, verifiable information would only deepen internal divisions, turning foreign policy into yet another front in an already fractured political landscape. From a military standpoint, strategists everywhere will be dissecting the event for lessons. If the operation was swift and limited, it could be seen as validation of modern doctrines emphasizing speed, surprise, and psychological impact. If it becomes messy or prolonged, it will reinforce arguments that even technologically superior forces cannot easily control political outcomes. Either way, armed forces around the world will study what worked, what didn't, and how narratives were managed or lost in the critical first hours. There is also a humanitarian perspective that risks being drowned out by geopolitics. Any escalation, even a brief one, carries consequences for civilians. Disruptions to power, water, healthcare, and food supply chains can have lasting effects long after headlines move on. Aid organizations will be watching closely, knowing that access could become more restricted just as needs increase. History shows that when politics hardens, humanitarian space often shrinks. Finally, there is the perspective of time. Moments like this rarely reveal their true significance immediately. What feels like a single explosive event often turns out to be the opening chapter of a much longer story. Sometimes it leads to rapid transformation. Other times it sinks into stalemate, sanctions, and quiet suffering. The danger lies in assuming clarity will arrive quickly. More often than not, it doesn't. In that sense, the most unsettling aspect of this situation may not be what has already happened, but what remains unresolved. A world that cannot agree on basic facts is a world primed for miscalculation. As different powers project their own interpretations onto the same event, the risk is not just conflict between states, but a deeper erosion of the shared reality needed to prevent conflict in the first place. Another perspective that deserves attention is how non-aligned and middle power countries may interpret what is unfolding. Nations that deliberately try to stay outside great power rivalry, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Middle East, are likely to see this as confirmation that neutrality offers limited protection in a world drifting toward raw power politics. For them, the lesson may not be ideological, but practical. Diversify alliances, strengthen internal security, and avoid becoming strategically indispensable to any single power. This could quietly accelerate a global trend toward hedging, where countries cooperate with multiple blocs while trusting none completely. There is also the information warfare dimension. This event has shown how control of narrative can rival control of territory. Competing versions of reality emerged almost instantly, each shaping public opinion before facts could be verified. Governments, platforms, and intelligence agencies will study how quickly uncertainty itself became a weapon. In future crises, the goal may not even be to convince the world of one truth, but to flood it with so many competing claims that consensus becomes impossible. That erosion of shared understanding makes coordinated global responses far harder to achieve. From a legal standpoint, international law faces another stress test. If force was used without broad international authorization, it weakens already fragile norms governing sovereignty and intervention. Even states that quietly approve of the outcome may hesitate to defend the method, knowing those same legal arguments could later be turned against them. Over time, repeated exceptions hollow out the rule itself, leaving power as the final arbiter. That shift favors strong states in the short term, but creates long-term instability that no one fully controls. Public opinion across the world will also shape outcomes in less obvious ways. In many countries, trust in institutions and media is already low. Confusion, contradictory reporting, and delayed confirmation feed cynicism. People may come away believing not one version of events, but that everyone is lying. That mindset weakens democratic accountability and makes populations more susceptible to radical narratives that promise certainty, even if it's false. There is also the perspective of exile communities and diasporas. Venezuelans abroad are watching events unfold with a mix of fear, hope, guilt, and helplessness. Their reactions will influence protests, lobbying efforts, and political pressure in host countries. Diasporas often act as emotional amplifiers in crises, shaping how foreign governments respond, especially in democratic societies where public pressure matters. Looking further ahead, this moment could influence how future leaders behave in times of crisis. If ambiguity and shock prove effective, others may imitate the strategy. If it backfires, leaders may retreat into caution and secrecy. Either way, decision-making becomes more compressed, with less room for diplomacy and more reliance on rapid, high-stakes moves. That increases the chance that mistakes escalate before they can be corrected. In the end, what makes this situation so dangerous is not just the possibility of conflict, but the normalization of uncertainty. When the world grows accustomed to waking up to unverified reports of explosions, captured leaders, and shifting narratives, the threshold for alarm rises. Each new crisis has to be louder, faster, more extreme to command attention. That dynamic erodes the ability to respond thoughtfully. Whether this episode becomes a turning point or a cautionary tale will depend on what follows. Transparency or silence, restraint or escalation, cooperation or fragmentation. For now, the world is left watching, interpreting, and projecting its own fears onto a story that is still being written. And in that space between what is known and what is assumed, the real risks continue to grow.